The thunderous crack of gunfire shattered the quiet dawn, as Xander Kane stood frozen in the middle of Lyndon's dusty Main Street, watching the blood bloom across his brother's chest. That moment in 1874 would haunt him for the next 5 years, following him like a shadow across the unforgiving landscape of Wyoming Territory. The sky stretched endlessly above Lyndon, Wyoming, as Xander guided his exhausted mount toward the weathered hitching post outside the town's only saloon. 5 years of running had carved deep lines into his face, making him look older than his 30 years. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and his eyes, once bright with youthful enthusiasm, now held the hardened gaze of a man who'd seen too much death. Lyndon hadn't changed much since he'd fled in the aftermath of the Blackwell gang shootout. The same tired buildings lined the main street, their wooden facades bleached by the relentless sun. The town was large enough to have a proper courthouse, a hotel, and a handful of businesses, but small enough that a stranger like him would draw notice. He dismounted with practiced ease, his worn leather boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. The weight of his Colt revolver pressed against his hip, a constant reminder of the life he'd chosen and the blood that stained his hands. "Water your horse, mister." A young boy appeared at his side, eager for a penny. Xander nodded, reaching into his pocket for a coin. "Make sure he gets enough. He's been carrying me since dawn." As the boy led his horse away, Xander turned toward the saloon. He needed a drink and information in that order. Word had reached him that Marshal Thomas Radcliffe, the man who'd been hunting him since that fateful day in Lyndon, had finally died of consumption. If true, it might mean Xander could stop running, maybe even clear his name. The saloon doors swung open easily beneath his touch, revealing a dimly lit interior that smelled of whiskey, smoke, and unwashed bodies. A few early patrons glanced up at his entrance, their eyes quickly returning to their drinks when they met his steel gaze. Xander moved to the bar, keeping his back to the wall out of habit. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, laying a coin on the counter. The man nodded, pouring a generous measure into a glass that looked cleaner than most establishments offered. Passing through, Xander took a slow sip, letting the liquor burn down his throat. "Might stay a while, depending. Got business in Lyndon, you could say that." Xander studied the barkeep, trying to determine if the man might recognize him. "Heard Marshal Radcliffe passed on 3 months back," the barkeep confirmed, wiping the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "Dr. Lillian tends to folks now when trouble comes. She patched up the new deputy just last week after a scuffle with some drovers." Dr. Lillian. Xander raised an eyebrow. Female doctors were uncommon, especially in frontier towns. Arrived about 2 years ago. Young but knows her business. Saved more lives than the previous sawbones ever did. The barkeep leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Town's been different since she came. Better, mostly." Xander nodded, filing away the information. A new doctor meant someone who wouldn't recognize him, which could work to his advantage. He finished his drink in silence, ordered another, and listened to the conversations around him, gathering the lay of the land. The town had grown since his departure. The railroad had finally connected Lyndon to the eastern lines, bringing increased commerce and a handful of new businesses. The silver mine north of town was producing well, and cattle ranches stretched across the surrounding plains. It was the kind of prosperity that Xander had once dreamed of being part of, before everything went wrong. By midday, he had secured a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Hollister. The woman hadn't asked too many questions, merely collected his money and handed him a key to a small but clean room on the second floor. Xander spent the remainder of the afternoon reacquainting himself with Lyndon, noting the changes and the constants. The bank where it had all happened still stood on the corner of Main Street and Church Avenue. He paused before it, memories flooding back his brother lying in a pool of blood, the accusations, the manhunt that followed. The truth of that day was buried with his brother and 3 members of the Blackwell gang. Only Xander and James Blackwell himself remained alive to tell the tale, and their versions differed drastically. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Xander made his way to the small cemetery at the edge of town. Rows of wooden crosses and modest stone markers dotted the enclosed ground. He found his brother's grave easily enough, marked by a simple headstone bearing the name Michael Kane and the date of his death. Xander removed his hat, holding it against his chest as he stood in silence. "I'm sorry, Michael," he whispered, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. "I should have been faster, should have seen it coming." The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, instantly alert, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. A woman stood several yards away, holding a small bunch of wildflowers. She wore a simple but well-made blue dress, her honey blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with bright eyes that studied him with undisguised curiosity. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Xander relaxed slightly, though his wariness remained. "You didn't, madam." She stepped closer, and he noticed the intelligence in her gaze as she assessed him. "You're new to Lyndon. I'm Daisy Lillian." "The doctor," he said, remembering the barkeep's words. She smiled, surprise evident on her face. "News travels fast in small towns, and you are," he hesitated. "Xander Smith." The alias slipped easily from his lips, one of many he'd used over the years. "Well, Mr. Smith, welcome to Lyndon." She glanced at the grave he stood before. "Did you know Michael Kane?" The question caught him off guard. "Why do you ask?" Dr. Lillian gestured toward the flowers in her hand. "I bring these once a week. No one else seems to remember him, except old Mr. Peterson, who tends the cemetery." Xander stared at her, bewildered. "You bring flowers to Michael Kane's grave. Why?" She tilted her head, studying him with renewed interest. "His was one of the first graves I visited when I arrived in Lyndon. The story people tell about what happened to him. It never sat right with me." "What story is that?" Xander asked, his voice carefully controlled. "That his brother killed him during a bank robbery gone wrong." She shook her head. "The accounts are contradictory, and none of the witnesses seem reliable. It feels like a convenient tale rather than the truth." Xander's heart pounded in his chest. For 5 years he'd been running from that lie, branded a murderer and a thief. "Maybe his brother was innocent," he said, watching her reaction closely. "I've often thought so." She laid the flowers at the base of the headstone. "Whatever happened that day, I believe the wrong man was blamed." Their eyes met, and for an instant, Xander felt as though she could see right through his disguise. But she simply offered another small smile before turning away. "Good evening, Mr. Smith. I hope you find what you're looking for in Lyndon." He watched her walk away, her graceful figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Something about Dr. Daisy Lillian unsettled him, not in the way that danger did, but in a manner he couldn't quite identify. For the first time in years, Xander felt a spark of hope that someone might believe his version of events. As night fell over Lyndon, Xander returned to his room at the boarding house, his mind filled with thoughts of the doctor and the possibility of redemption. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by memories of gunfire and his brother's final words. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Xander. Tell them the truth." The following morning dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the summer heat. Xander rose early, his old habits preventing him from sleeping past dawn. After a simple breakfast in the boarding house dining room, he set out with a purpose to find work. If he intended to stay in Lyndon long enough to clear his name, he would need funds and a reason for his presence that wouldn't arouse suspicion. The livery stable on the edge of town seemed the most promising option. Horses had always been Xander's specialty, even before his life had fallen apart. The owner, a gruff older man named Patrick Hodges, eyed him skeptically as Xander inquired about employment. "Know anything about horses?" Hodges asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Raised with them," Xander replied truthfully. "Can break the meanest Mustang you've got and doctor any ailment from colic to hoof rot." Hodges grunted, unimpressed by the claim. "Talk's cheap. Show me." For the next hour, Xander demonstrated his abilities with a particularly troublesome bay gelding that, according to Hodges, had thrown every hand who'd attempted to ride him. By the time Xander had finished, the horse was responding to gentle pressure from his knees and the lightest touch on the reins. "Well, I'll be damned," Hodges muttered, stroking his gray beard. "Been trying to break that devil for 2 weeks. You've got yourself a job, Mr. Smith. $6 a week, sunrise to sunset. Sundays off unless there's an emergency." Xander nodded, accepting the terms. The pay was fair, and the work would keep him occupied while he investigated the possibility of clearing his name. As he began familiarizing himself with the stable's layout and the horses in Hodges' care, he couldn't help but wonder about Dr. Lillian. Her words at the cemetery had ignited a dangerous hope within him. Around midday, as Xander was mucking out stalls, the sound of a carriage approaching drew his attention. He stepped outside to see a smart buggy pull up, Dr. Lillian at the reins. She wore a practical riding outfit, her blonde hair partially concealed beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her face from the sun. "Mr. Smith," she called, a hint of surprise in her voice. "I see you've found employment already." He moved to help her down from the buggy. "Just started today, madam. I'm pleased to hear it." Her hand was small but firm in his as he assisted her. "Mr. Hodges is a fair employer, if a bit rough around the edges. I've dealt with worse." He released her hand, noticing how the touch lingered in his awareness. "What brings you to the livery?" "My horse threw a shoe on the way back from the Peterson homestead." She gestured to the mare harnessed to her buggy. "Mrs. Peterson is expecting her 4th child any day now, and I've been checking on her regularly." Xander nodded, moving to examine the horse's hoof. "I can have this fixed in no time if Mr. Hodges has the supplies. I would appreciate that." She watched him as he worked, her eyes curious. "You handle horses well. Where did you learn?" "My father's ranch," he answered, keeping to partial truths. "Had a way with them since I was a boy." "And what brought you to Lyndon, Mr. Smith?" Her question was casual, but Xander sensed genuine interest behind it. He straightened, meeting her gaze. "Looking for a fresh start, I suppose." "Aren't we all?" A shadow passed over her features before she smiled again. "This town has a way of drawing people seeking second chances." Before Xander could respond, Hodges emerged from the back of the stable, his expression brightening at the sight of the doctor. "Doc Lillian." "What brings you by?" "Thrown shoe, Mr. Hodges. Your new hand has already offered to fix it for me." Hodges nodded approvingly. "Smith knows his business. I'll fetch the tools." As Hodges disappeared into the stable, Dr. Lillian turned back to Xander. "I'm hosting a small gathering at my home this Saturday evening. Nothing formal, just a few of the townspeople for dinner and conversation. You would be welcome to attend, Mr. Smith, if you're interested in meeting more of Lyndon's residents." The invitation caught him off guard. Socializing meant potential recognition, which was dangerous, but it also presented an opportunity to gather information about the town's perception of the events 5 years ago. That's kind of you, doctor. I'll consider it. Please do. Around 6 o'clock. She smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression that made something twist in Xander's chest. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him without suspicion or fear. Hodges returned with the necessary tools, and Xander set about removing the damaged shoe and preparing the horse's hoof for a replacement. As he worked, he was acutely aware of Dr. Lillian's presence, her gaze occasionally falling upon him with an interest that both concerned and intrigued him. When the job was complete, she paid Hodges for the service and thanked Xander with another of those smiles that seemed to reach places within him long closed off. "Until Saturday, perhaps," she said, climbing back into her buggy. "Perhaps," he echoed, stepping back as she flicked the reins and guided the horse back toward town. Hodges watched the buggy disappear down the road. "Fine woman, the doctor. Smart as a whip and pretty to boot. Half the men in town have tried courting her, but she keeps to herself mostly." "Seems dedicated to her work," Xander observed neutrally. "That she is. Changed this town for the better, too." Hodges spat another stream of tobacco juice. "Before she arrived, nearest doctor was in Cheyenne. Lost too many folks to accidents and illnesses that might have been treated. Now we've got our own healer, and a damn good one at that." The rest of the day passed quickly as Xander settled into the routine of stable work. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the thoughts that plagued him, memories of the past and uncertainties about his future in Lyndon. By sunset, his muscles ached pleasantly, and the familiar scent of horses and hay had embedded itself in his clothing. He took dinner at the small restaurant adjacent to the hotel, keeping to himself as he observed the other patrons. Lyndon's population had grown since his departure, with many faces he didn't recognize mingling with the few he did. None seemed to look at him with suspicion, which was encouraging. As he walked back to the boarding house in the gathering darkness, Xander's thoughts turned once again to Dr. Lillian. Her apparent belief in his innocence, though she didn't know she was speaking to the accused man himself, was both comforting and concerning. What had led her to question the accepted narrative? And if she discovered his true identity, would her sympathetic view remain unchanged? Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of late summer across the plains. Xander had spent the intervening days establishing himself at the livery, earning Hodges' grudging respect and the acceptance of the other workers. He had also carefully observed the town, noting the location of the sheriff's office, now occupied by a young deputy named Harris, and eavesdropping on conversations when possible to gauge the town's memory of the incident 5 years ago. What he discovered was both troubling and promising. The story of Xander Kane's betrayal and murder of his brother during a bank robbery had become something of a local legend, embellished over time. Some versions now included additional victims, or claimed that Xander had been working with the notorious Blackwell gang all along. However, the passage of time had dulled the town's interest in the matter, and few spoke of it with any regularity. As evening approached, Xander stood in his small room at the boarding house, debating whether to attend Dr. Lillian's gathering. The risks were significant. Someone might recognize him, or he might reveal too much in conversation. But the potential rewards were equally compelling. Information about the town's current understanding of the incident could prove valuable, and the doctor herself intrigued him more than he cared to admit. In the end, curiosity won out over caution. Xander donned his cleanest shirt and the only jacket he owned that wasn't travel-worn. He couldn't remember the last time he'd attended a social function. The years of solitude had left him ill-prepared for polite conversation. Dr. Lillian's home stood on the eastern edge of town, a modest but well-maintained two-story structure with a small garden visible from the front gate. Light spilled from the windows, and the sound of conversation and laughter drifted out into the evening air. Xander hesitated at the gate, second thoughts nearly overwhelming his resolve. "Mr. Smith, you decided to come after all." "Doctor." Lillian's voice drew his attention to the front door, where she stood framed in golden lamplight. Her dress was simple but elegant, a deep green that complemented her fair complexion. Her hair was arranged differently than he'd seen before, with soft curls framing her face. "Thought it might be good to meet more of the townsfolk," he replied, pushing open the gate and approaching the house. She smiled, stepping aside to allow him entry. "I'm glad. Please come in." The interior of the house was as tasteful and understated as its exterior. A parlor to the right of the entrance hall had been arranged for the gathering, with comfortable seating and a table laden with food and drinks. About a dozen people milled about, engaged in conversation. Xander recognized several faces from his observations around town: the banker, Mr. Williams, the general store owner and his wife, Deputy Harris and his young bride, and a few others whose names he didn't know. "Doctor." Lillian guided him into the room, introducing him as Mr. Smith, recently arrived in Lyndon and already proving himself invaluable at Hodge's livery. The introductions were met with polite interest, though Xander noted a flash of recognition in the banker's eyes that sent a chill down his spine. Williams had been present on the day of the bank robbery, though he hadn't been the one to identify Xander as his brother's killer. "Drink, Mr. Smith," Dr. Lillian offered, gesturing to a selection of beverages. "Whiskey if you have it," he replied, fighting the urge to leave immediately. As she poured him a modest glass, she leaned closer, her voice low. "You look as though you're planning an escape route." The observation, so astute, nearly made him choke. "Not fond of crowds," he managed, taking the drink gratefully. "It gets easier," she assured him. "Besides, these are good people. Lyndon has its share of troubles, as all towns do, but there's a sense of community here that I've found lacking elsewhere." "You haven't always lived in Lyndon, then?" he asked, seizing the opportunity to shift attention away from himself. "No." A shadow passed over her features. "I grew up in Boston, studied medicine there, came west after." She paused, seeming to reconsider her words. "After deciding I needed a change." Before Xander could inquire further, they were joined by Deputy Harris, a fresh-faced young man with an earnest expression. "Dr. Lillian, Mr. Smith." Harris nodded to each of them. "Settling in all right, Smith. Hodges says you've got away with the more difficult horses." "Just experience," Xander replied modestly, careful to maintain his pleasant demeanor despite the discomfort of conversing with a lawman. "We could use someone like you for the town's mounted patrol," Harris continued. "Since Marshal Radcliffe passed, I've been trying to organize regular patrols of the surrounding area. Blackwell's gang has been spotted in the territory again." Xander's grip tightened on his glass. "Blackwell? I thought his gang was broken up years ago." Harris shook his head. "Most were killed or captured, but James Blackwell himself escaped. There have been robberies bearing his signature as far north as Montana and as far east as Nebraska over the years. Word is he's back in Wyoming now." "Terrible business," Dr. Lillian murmured. "I've heard stories about the damage that man has done." "You don't know the half of it, Doctor," Harris replied grimly. 5 years ago, right here in Lyndon, his gang attempted to rob the bank. It went wrong and a local man was killed. His own brother shot him, if you can believe it. Xander's heart hammered in his chest. "His brother?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Xander Kane," Harris confirmed. "Turned out he'd been working with Blackwell all along, according to the witnesses. Shot his brother Michael when the robbery went sideways. then fled with what money they managed to grab. Marshal Radcliffe hunted Kane for years but never caught him. Dr. Lillian's eyes flicked to Xander's face, then back to the deputy. I've heard conflicting accounts of that day, Deputy Harris. Some say Xander Kane was trying to stop the robbery, not participate in it. Harris shrugged. That's not what the official report says. 3 witnesses identified Kane as the shooter, including Mr. Williams over there. He gestured toward the banker. Said they saw Kane arguing with his brother just before drawing his gun and firing point blank. And the other members of the Blackwell gang, Dr. Lillian pressed. Were they caught? 3 were killed in the shootout that followed. Blackwell himself escaped, along with Kane. That's why I believe they were working together. Xander took a long sip of his whiskey, using the moment to compose himself. Sounds like a tragic situation, he said finally. The kind of thing that can tear a town apart. Lyndon's resilient, Harris replied. We've moved forward, but folks around here don't forget. If either Kane or Blackwell ever showed their faces in this town again. He let the implication hang in the air. Dr. Lillian cleared her throat delicately. Perhaps we could discuss more pleasant topics. This is meant to be a social gathering, after all. Harris had the grace to look abashed. Of course, Doctor. My apologies. The conversation shifted to more mundane matters, but Xander remained distracted, his thoughts churning with the knowledge that James Blackwell had been sighted in the territory. If the outlaw truly had returned to Wyoming, it could mean an opportunity for Xander to finally confront the man whose actions had destroyed his life. Or it could bring danger back to his doorstep, just as he was establishing a tenuous peace in Lyndon. Throughout the evening, Xander was aware of Dr. Lillian's occasional glances in his direction, her expression thoughtful. Had she noticed his reaction to the discussion of the bank robbery? Did she suspect his true identity? The uncertainty gnawed at him, even as he maintained his facade of polite interest in the conversations around him. As the gathering began to disperse, Xander prepared to make his exit, having endured as much social interaction as he could manage. He was nearly to the door when Dr. Lillian appeared at his side. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Smith?" she asked, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. "It's been a long day," he offered by way of excuse. "Thank you for the invitation. It was informative." Her eyes studied his face as though searching for something beneath the surface. "Would you mind staying a moment? I could use some help moving a few things in my study." The request was clearly a pretext, but Xander found himself nodding in agreement, curious about what she truly wanted to discuss. As the last of the other guests departed, Dr. Lillian led him down a short hallway to a room at the rear of the house. Unlike the tastefully decorated parlor, the study was cluttered with books, papers, and medical implements. A large desk dominated one wall, while shelves crammed with volumes on medicine and various other subjects lined the remaining space. "You have quite a collection," Xander observed, genuinely impressed. "Knowledge is the best medicine," she replied, closing the door behind them. Instead of indicating any furniture that needed moving, she gestured for him to take a seat in one of 2 chairs positioned near a small fireplace. "Please sit." Xander complied, wariness creeping back into his posture as she took the seat opposite him. "I'm guessing you don't actually need help moving anything." A small smile played at her lips. "Perceptive of you." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Smith, if that is indeed your name, you reacted rather strongly to Deputy Harris's account of the bank robbery 5 years ago." Xander maintained his neutral expression with effort. "It's a disturbing story." "Yes, it is." She held his gaze steadily. "Particularly disturbing when the truth has been buried beneath convenient lies." His pulse quickened. "What makes you think the deputy's version isn't accurate?" because I've spent the past 2 years piecing together what really happened that day." She rose and moved to her desk, opening a drawer and withdrawing a folder filled with papers. Newspaper accounts, interviews with townspeople, copies of the official reports. They're full of inconsistencies. Xander remained silent, watching as she returned to her seat with the folder. "3 witnesses claimed to see Xander Kane shoot his brother," she continued. "Mr. Williams, the banker, Samuel Thorne, a local rancher, and Peter Davis, a drifter who left town the following week and hasn't been seen since." "Sounds conclusive," Xander said carefully. "Doctor?" Lillian shook her head. "Williams was behind his desk when the shooting occurred, with limited visibility of the main floor. Thorne had poor eyesight. Even then he's nearly blind now, and Davis's description of events changed with each retelling." She removed several papers from the folder. "But most telling is this: the bullet that killed Michael Kane." She handed him a document, a medical examiner's report from Cheyenne, dated 2 weeks after the robbery. "I had this sent to me when I first became interested in the case." The bullet that killed Michael Kane was a .44 caliber, fired from a Smith & Wesson revolver. Xander stared at the report, his throat suddenly dry. "And, according to town records, Xander Kane carried a Colt .45. The Blackwell gang was known to favor Smith & Wesson .44s. Her eyes bore into his. Michael Kane wasn't killed by his brother's gun. The revelation hung in the air between them. Xander's hands trembled slightly as he returned the report to her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I believe you are Xander Kane," she said simply. "And I believe you're innocent of your brother's murder." The accusation and simultaneous absolution struck him like a physical blow. Years of hiding, of carrying the weight of false accusations, made denial his instinctive response. "That's a serious claim, Doctor." "It is." She set the folder aside. "When I first came to Lyndon, I heard the story of the Kane brothers as a cautionary tale about betrayal. But as a doctor, I've learned to look beyond the obvious symptoms to find the true cause of an ailment. The more I examined the facts of that day, the more convinced I became that a grave injustice had occurred. And if I were this Xander Kane," he said slowly, "what would you intend to do with that information?" "Help you clear your name," she replied without hesitation. "The real killer still walks free, Mr. Kane. And if Deputy Harris is correct about James Blackwell being back in the territory, he may be closer than you think." Xander rose from his chair, moving to the window to gaze out at the darkened street. The weight of his secret, carried for so long, pressed down on him. To share it now with this woman he barely knew was a risk that could cost him his freedom or his life. "Why would you help me?" he asked finally, turning back to face her. "You have no stake in this, Doctor." Lillian's expression softened. "Everyone deserves justice, Mr. Kane, even those who believe themselves beyond redemption." Her words pierced something deep within him, a wall he'd built around his heart to survive the years of isolation and fear. "If I were Xander Kane," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how could you be certain I didn't kill my brother?" "I can't be absolutely certain," she admitted. "But the evidence suggests otherwise, and—" She hesitated, a flush creeping into her cheeks. "There's something about you, a weight you carry, a sadness in your eyes. It's not the burden of guilt I see, but of loss and injustice." Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, Xander felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a connection, a spark of understanding that transcended words. It frightened and exhilarated him in equal measure. "My brother was trying to stop the robbery," he said finally, the admission rushing out like water through a broken dam. "We both were. Michael saw them enter the bank, recognized James Blackwell from wanted posters. I followed him inside, tried to talk him into waiting for the marshal, but he was always headstrong. Dr. Lillian remained silent, allowing him to continue. It happened so fast. Blackwell recognized us, or at least realized we weren't there to make a deposit. He drew first, shot Michael before either of us could react. I returned fire, hit one of his men. The others started shooting, and people were screaming. He closed his eyes, the memories washing over him in vivid detail. When it was over, Michael was dying, and Blackwell was shouting that I'd shot my own brother for the money. Somehow, people believed him. Because it was easier than accepting that two ordinary citizens had tried to be heroes, Dr. Lillian suggested softly. And because Blackwell was clever enough to create confusion in the moment. Xander nodded, opening his eyes to find her standing before him, compassion evident in her gaze. I ran because I knew no one would believe me. The marshal was already treating me like a suspect when I left the bank. By nightfall, I was a fugitive. And now you've returned to clear your name, she concluded. When I heard Radcliffe had died, I thought, maybe with time the truth might emerge. He exhaled slowly, the relief of sharing his burden tempered by the fear of what might come next. But if Blackwell is truly back in the territory, then we have an opportunity, Dr. Lillian said firmly, to catch him and force the truth into the open. Xander raised an eyebrow. This isn't your fight, Doctor. Daisy, she corrected him. And injustice is everyone's fight, Mr. Kane. Xander, he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of their conversation. If we're going to be conspirators, we might as well use first names. She returned his smile, a warmth in her expression that reached her eyes. Xander, then. And yes, you'll need allies if you're to clear your name without ending up in a cell or worse. He knew she was right, though the idea of placing his fate in another's hands went against every instinct he'd developed over the past 5 years. Still, there was something about Daisy Lillian that inspired trust, a steadiness and clarity of purpose that reminded him of qualities his brother had possessed. It won't be safe, he warned. If Blackwell discovers I'm in Lyndon, he'll come for me, and anyone associated with me would be in danger. I'm aware of the risks, she replied, her voice steady, but I've never been one to choose safety over what's right. As they stood in the quiet study, the rest of the world seeming distant beyond its walls, Xander felt the first genuine stirring of hope in years. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope had betrayed him before, but in that moment, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps his long nightmare might finally be coming to an end. Then I accept your help, Daisy, he said, extending his hand. Though God knows I probably shouldn't. She took his hand in hers, her grip firm and reassuring. Sometimes faith in others is all we have to carry us through the darkness, Xander, even for those who have walked in shadow as long as you have. The touch of her hand in his lingered, a connection that represented more than just an alliance of purpose. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, a promise of possibilities he had long since abandoned. As Daisy's fingers slowly slipped from his, Xander knew with certainty that his return to Lyndon had irrevocably altered his path for better or worse, remained to be seen. In the days that followed their conversation, Xander maintained his persona as the quiet, stable hand, while Daisy discreetly gathered information about the Blackwell gang's recent activities. They met in the evenings at her home, using the pretext of Xander assisting with repairs to explain his presence to any curious observers. These meetings, ostensibly focused on their investigation, became something Xander found himself anticipating with an eagerness that both concerned and invigorated him. Railroad payrolls have been hit in 3 locations over the past 2 months, Daisy informed him on a warm evening in early September, spreading a map across her desk. Here, and here. She indicated points in northern Wyoming and southern Montana. All bear Blackwell's signature, quick, violent, and with extraordinary inside knowledge of the shipments. Xander studied the map, noting the pattern. He's working his way south, he observed. If he continues, the Lyndon branch of the First National Bank would be a logical target. They handle the payroll for the silver mine now. Exactly what I was thinking. Daisy tucked a stray strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear, a gesture Xander had come to find endearing. The next payroll arrives on Friday, September 17th. If Blackwell is following his established pattern, that would be when he strikes. That's less than 2 weeks away, Xander murmured, calculations running through his mind. Not much time to prepare. No, but it's enough. Her confidence was unwavering. Deputy Harris may be young, but he's not a fool. If we present him with evidence of the pattern, he could arrange additional security for the payroll without knowing your involvement. Xander shook his head. It's too risky. If Blackwell suspects a trap, he'll simply move on to another target. I need to confront him, force him to admit what happened 5 years ago. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Daisy challenged. Blackwell won't be alone, and he certainly won't confess to a crime just because you ask nicely. We need witnesses, Xander. People who will hear the truth and believe it. He paced the length of the study, frustration evident in every line of his body. The moment I approach Harris or anyone in an official capacity, I'll be arrested. The charges against me haven't disappeared simply because Radcliffe is dead. Then we need leverage, Daisy said thoughtfully. Something that would make Blackwell confess publicly. She tapped her fingers against the desk, brow furrowed in concentration. What if we could trap him in his own lie? How? The bullet, she said, excitement growing in her voice. The one that killed your brother. If we could prove conclusively that it couldn't have come from your gun. The forensic evidence is 5 years old, Xander pointed out. And even if it weren't, Blackwell could simply claim I used a different weapon that day. Daisy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but she remained determined. There must be another way. Perhaps one of Blackwell's former associates, someone who was there that day who might be willing to testify about what really happened. Xander considered the suggestion. The 3 gang members who were with Blackwell in the bank died in the shootout, but there was a lookout, a man named Ellis Fletcher. He wasn't inside when it happened, but he would have heard Blackwell's version immediately afterward. Is he still with the gang? Last I heard, he was serving time in the territorial prison for a stage robbery near Laramie. Xander's mind raced with possibilities. If he's still there, and if we could somehow get him to corroborate my story. That's something we can work with, Daisy said, reaching for pen and paper. I'll write to the warden at the territorial prison, inquiring about Fletcher's status. As a doctor, I can claim interest in his case from a medical perspective without arousing suspicion. As she wrote, Xander watched her, the determined set of her jaw, the careful precision of her handwriting, the intelligence that shone in her eyes. In the short time since he'd revealed his true identity to her, Daisy had become not just an ally but a friend, someone he could trust with his darkest secrets and his fragile hopes. It was a novel experience for a man who had spent years trusting no one. You're staring, she observed without looking up from her letter, a small smile playing at her lips. Just thinking, he replied, embarrassed at being caught, about how different things might have been if someone had believed me 5 years ago. She set down her pen, meeting his gaze directly. I believe you now, Xander, and we will make others believe too. The conviction in her voice stirred something within him, a feeling he had thought long dead. Before he could examine it too closely, a knock at the front door interrupted the moment. Daisy frowned, glancing at the small clock on her desk. It's nearly 9. I'm not expecting anyone. I'll stay out of sight, Xander said, moving toward the back of the study where he wouldn't be visible from the doorway. Daisy nodded, rising to answer the door. Xander listened intently as she greeted the visitor, tension coiling in his muscles when he recognized Deputy Harris's voice. "Evening, Doctor. Sorry to disturb you so late, but we've had word of trouble heading our way." The deputy sounded concerned. "May I come in?" "Of course," Daisy replied smoothly. "What kind of trouble?" Their footsteps moved toward the parlor, away from the study, but Xander could still hear their conversation clearly through the partially open door. "James Blackwell," Harris said grimly. "Got a telegram from the territorial marshal's office today. They've tracked his gang to within 50 miles of Lyndon. Believe they might be planning to hit the bank during the next payroll delivery." "That's alarming," Daisy responded, her voice betraying none of the knowledge she already possessed. "What can be done?" "I'm organizing extra security for the bank, deputizing some reliable men. Wanted to ask if you'd be willing to have extra medical supplies ready, just in case things turn ugly." "Of course. I'll prepare immediately." "Appreciate it, Doctor." Harris hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. "There's something else. Marshal Jackson in Cheyenne mentioned that Xander Kane has been spotted in the territory recently. Given his connection to Blackwell, they think he might be involved in these robberies." Xander's breath caught in his throat. Someone had recognized him, somewhere between Cheyenne and Lyndon. "I see," Daisy said carefully. "And you believe Kane might come to Lyndon? It's possible." This is where it all started, after all. The marshal thinks Kane might harbor a grudge against the town for how things played out. "That would be concerning indeed," Daisy replied, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "I'll keep an eye out for any strangers in town." "That's just it," Harris continued. "Kane might not look like a stranger anymore. It's been 5 years he could have changed his appearance. That's why I'm asking all the townspeople to be vigilant, especially with newcomers." There was a pointed quality to Harris's last statement that sent a chill down Xander's spine. "Did the deputy suspect something about Mr. Smith?" "I understand," Daisy assured him. "I'll be careful." "Good." The relief in Harris's voice was evident. "You're well respected in Lyndon, Doctor. People trust your judgment. If you notice anything suspicious, I hope you'll come to me immediately." "You can count on me to do what's right, Deputy," she replied, the ambiguity of her promise lost on Harris but clear to Xander. After a few more minutes of conversation about security arrangements, Harris took his leave. Xander remained hidden until Daisy returned to the study, closing and locking the door behind her. "He suspects," Xander said without preamble. "Not specifically me, perhaps, but he's alert to the possibility of Kane being in town." Daisy nodded, her expression troubled. "It complicates matters, but doesn't change our course. If anything, it makes our timeline more urgent. If Blackwell truly is planning to hit the bank during the next payroll, we have very little time to prepare." "I should leave Lyndon," Xander said, the words paining him even as he spoke them. "My presence puts you in danger. If Harris discovers you've been harboring me, no." The force of her refusal surprised them both. Running solved nothing 5 years ago. It won't solve anything now. "This isn't just about me anymore," he argued. "It's about you, your reputation, your safety." Daisy stepped closer to him, determination blazing in her eyes. "I made my choice when I decided to help you, Xander. I knew the risks then, and I accept them now." Their gazes locked, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Xander was acutely aware of her proximity, of the subtle floral scent that always seemed to surround her, of the way the lamplight caught the golden highlights in her hair. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why risk everything for a man you barely know, for a cause that isn't yours?" She didn't look away, her eyes holding his steadily. "Because I recognized something in you from the moment we met at the cemetery. A good man carrying a burden too heavy for any one person to bear alone." "You can't know that," he countered. "You can't know what I've done, what I've become in these 5 years. I know enough." Her hand rose, hesitating briefly before coming to rest against his cheek. The touch was gentle, but it sent currents of awareness through his entire body. "I know that you returned to the place where you lost everything, seeking justice rather than revenge. I know that you speak of your brother with love and regret, not bitterness. Those aren't the actions or words of the man the wanted posters describe." Xander stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the fragile connection between them. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with kindness, with genuine care. The sensation was almost overwhelming. "Daisy," he began, uncertain what he intended to say. Before he could continue, she withdrew her hand, a flush rising in her cheeks. "We should focus on our plan," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "The letter to the warden about Fletcher and preparing for Blackwell's potential arrival." Xander nodded, ignoring the pang of disappointment at the loss of her touch. "You're right, time is short." As they returned to their planning, a new tension hummed beneath their practical discussions, an awareness of something shifting between them. Something neither was quite ready to acknowledge, but that could not be entirely denied. For a man who had lived in darkness for so long, the first glimmer of dawn was as terrifying as it was beautiful. The following week passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Daisy received a response from the territorial prison warden, confirming that Ellis Fletcher remained incarcerated, but was due for release in less than a month for good behavior. The timing was frustrating, too late to be of immediate help with Blackwell's imminent arrival, but suggesting a potential witness for the future if their current plan failed. Meanwhile, Deputy Harris had indeed begun to eye Mr. Smith with increasing suspicion, asking pointed questions around town about his background and watching him from a distance when their paths crossed. Xander maintained his cover, focusing on his work at the livery while secretly preparing for Blackwell's arrival. The night before the payroll was due to arrive, Xander met Daisy at her home after dark, taking care to ensure he wasn't followed. They had refined their plan as much as possible given the constraints they faced. Xander would position himself near the bank when the payroll arrived, hoping to intercept Blackwell before the robbery began. Daisy would be nearby, ostensibly attending to a patient in the general store across the street, ready to summon help or provide medical assistance as needed. "It's a risk," Daisy said as they reviewed the plan one final time. "Blackwell might have lookouts who'll recognize you before you can get close to him." "It's the best chance we have," Xander replied, studying the rough map of the town center they'd drawn. "If I can get him alone, force him to admit the truth." "And if he refuses?" Daisy pressed. "If he tries to kill you instead?" Xander's hand moved instinctively to the Colt at his hip. "Then I'll defend myself." "That's what I'm afraid of," she murmured. "If you kill him, the truth dies with him. You'd still be a wanted man, perhaps with fresh blood on your hands." "I don't intend to kill him," Xander assured her, though they both knew intentions often meant little when guns were drawn. "I want justice, not vengeance." Daisy nodded, though concern still shadowed her eyes. "I believe you, but Blackwell is a desperate man with nothing to lose." "Be careful, Xander. Always am." He attempted a reassuring smile, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his own. "This ends tomorrow, one way or another." The touch of his hand sent warmth spreading through Daisy's arm. She turned her palm upward, interlacing their fingers in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "Promise me something," she said softly. What's that? Promise me you'll still be alive when the sun sets tomorrow. Her voice wavered slightly, revealing the depth of her concern. Whatever happens with Blackwell, with your name, with everything else, just be alive. The naked emotion in her request struck Xander to his core. In the weeks since his arrival in Lyndon, Daisy Lillian had somehow become essential to him in a way no one had been since his brother's death. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "I promise," he replied, his voice rough with feeling. "I've got too much to live for now." Their eyes met across the table, the implications of his words hanging in the air between them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they leaned toward each other, the distance between them narrowing until Xander could feel the warmth of her breath against his lips. A sudden pounding at the front door shattered the moment. They jerked apart, instinctively reaching for weapons, Xander his revolver, Daisy the small derringer she kept in her desk drawer. "Dr. Lillian," Deputy Harris's voice called from outside. "Open up! It's urgent." Daisy and Xander exchanged alarmed glances. "The back door," she whispered urgently. "Go." Xander hesitated. "If he's here for me, go," she repeated firmly. "We can't help anyone if you're arrested now." With a reluctant nod, Xander moved silently toward the back of the house as Daisy went to answer the door, composing herself with remarkable speed. He paused in the darkened kitchen, close enough to hear their conversation while remaining out of sight. "Deputy Harris," Daisy greeted, a perfect note of surprised concern in her voice. "What's happened?" "Blackwell's gang hit the Thompson ranch an hour ago," Harris replied, his words tumbling out in his haste. "Killed 2 ranch hands and made off with the horses. They're heading this way, Doctor. The payroll's arriving early first light tomorrow instead of noon." Xander's blood ran cold. Their carefully laid plans were collapsing before they'd even begun. "My God," Daisy gasped, her shock genuine. "Have you sent for help from Cheyenne?" "Telegraphed the marshal's office, but they won't get men here before tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. I've deputized 8 men, but if Blackwell brings his full gang—" Harris trailed off, the implications clear. "What can I do?" Daisy asked. "Prepare for casualties," Harris replied grimly. "And stay off the streets tomorrow. This could get ugly, of course. I'll have everything ready." After a few more exchanges, Harris departed, presumably to continue his preparations for the coming confrontation. Xander emerged from the kitchen as soon as Daisy closed and locked the front door. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "Blackwell's moving faster than we anticipated, and he's already killed." Daisy nodded, her face pale but determined. "We need to adjust our plan." "There's no time," Xander countered, "and Harris will have men watching the bank." "I wouldn't get within 100 yards of Blackwell before being spotted." "Then what do we do?" Xander paced the small parlor, mind racing through possibilities. "The ranch attack was a diversion," he said finally. "Blackwell's trying to spread the town's defenders thin, force Harris to commit men to protecting the outlying properties." "Which means he'll have fewer men at the bank," Daisy concluded. "Exactly." Xander stopped pacing, decision made. "I need to get to the bank before Blackwell does. I know how he thinks, how he plans his robberies, if I can position myself inside." "That's suicide," Daisy protested. "You'd be trapped between Blackwell's gang and Harris's deputies, both shooting at you." "Not if I can convince Harris I'm on his side." Xander's expression was grim but resolute. "It's time to stop hiding, Daisy. I need to tell Harris who I really am." "What?" She stared at him in disbelief. "He'll arrest you on the spot, maybe. But if I explain about Blackwell, about what really happened 5 years ago, and if I offer to help stop the robbery, he might at least listen before putting me in irons." Daisy shook her head, fear evident in her eyes. "It's too great a risk. Harris is young, eager to prove himself. He might see handing you over to the territorial marshal as the perfect opportunity to advance his career. It's a risk I have to take, Xander insisted. This may be my only chance to confront Blackwell with witnesses present, to force the truth into the open. They argued for nearly an hour, Daisy proposing alternative plans that Xander systematically dismissed as impractical given their compressed timeline. Finally, she saw the unyielding determination in his eyes and relented, though reluctance showed in every line of her body. "If you're determined to do this, then I'm coming with you to speak to Harris," she said firmly. "Absolutely not," Xander replied. "You've risked enough already. My reputation in this town might be the only thing that gets Harris to listen to you," she countered. "He respects me. If I vouch for you, tell him I've seen evidence that supports your innocence. And link yourself publicly to a wanted man." Xander shook his head. "I won't let you sacrifice everything you've built here. It's not your decision to make." She stepped closer, her chin raised in defiance. "I believe in you, Xander Kane. I believe in your innocence and your right to justice, and I'm willing to stake my reputation on that belief." The fierce determination in her expression left no room for argument. Xander recognized the same stubborn courage that had first drawn him to her, a woman who followed her convictions regardless of personal cost. "All right," he conceded finally. "We'll approach Harris together tonight." "But if things go wrong, if he won't listen, they won't," she interrupted with more confidence than either of them truly felt. "And he will." As they prepared to leave for the deputy's office, gathering the evidence they had accumulated about Blackwell's activities and Xander's innocence, a heavy weight seemed to settle on both their shoulders, the knowledge that after tonight, nothing would be the same, for better or worse. At the door, Xander paused, turning to face Daisy. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "I want you to know that meeting you, it's made all the difference. For the first time in 5 years, I've remembered what it feels like to hope." Daisy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Hope is just the beginning, Xander. There's so much more waiting for you for us when this is over." The promise in her words carried them into the night, toward a confrontation that would determine not only Xander's fate, but the future they both had begun to envision together. Deputy Harris's reaction to Xander's revelation was predictably hostile. His hand had gone immediately to his gun when Xander stated his true identity, and only Daisy's calm intervention had prevented the situation from escalating to violence. Now, an hour later, they sat in the small sheriff's office, tension thick in the air as Harris paced behind his desk, processing the information they had presented. "Let me get this straight," he said for the third time. "You're claiming that James Blackwell killed Michael Kane, framed you for it, and now, 5 years later, you've returned to Lyndon just as Blackwell happens to be planning another robbery here." "I returned because I heard Marshal Radcliffe had died," Xander corrected, his patience wearing thin despite the precariousness of his position. "Finding out Blackwell was in the area was coincidence, but one I intend to use to clear my name." "Mighty convenient coincidence," Harris muttered skeptically. Daisy leaned forward in her chair. "Deputy, I've shown you the medical examiner's report on the bullet that killed Michael Kane. It couldn't have come from Xander's gun. That alone should raise serious questions about the official version of events." Harris frowned, glancing at the document spread across his desk. "It's compelling, I'll grant you that. But it's not enough to overturn 5 years of accepted truth, especially not on the eve of what might be the biggest gunfight this town has seen since the last time Blackwell was here," Xander finished for him. "I understand your skepticism, Deputy. I'd feel the same in your position. That's why I'm not asking you to clear my name tonight. I'm offering to help you stop Blackwell tomorrow. And why would I trust a wanted man at my back in a firefight? Harris challenged. Because I know Blackwell better than anyone, Xander replied steadily. I've spent 5 years studying his patterns, tracking his movements whenever I could. I know how he thinks, how he plans his robberies. And because the alternative is to lock Xander up and face Blackwell's gang with one fewer experienced gun, Daisy added pragmatically. Harris rubbed his temple, indecision clear in his youthful features. At 25, he was the youngest deputy in the county, appointed largely because no one else wanted the job after Radcliffe's death. The responsibility of protecting Lyndon weighed heavily on him, and the prospect of facing Blackwell's notorious gang clearly terrified him, though he strove to hide it. If I were to consider this, he said finally, I'd need some guarantee that you won't simply use the chaos of the situation to escape, or worse, join forces with Blackwell. I can give you my word, Xander offered, knowing how little that might mean to the deputy. I'll vouch for him, Daisy added firmly. And I'll be there myself, deputy. I was planning to set up a field hospital in the Mercantile across from the bank. I'll be able to see everything that happens. Harris's eyebrows shot up. You most certainly will not, doctor. It's too dangerous. People will be injured, she countered. You know as well as I do that minutes can mean the difference between life and death with gunshot wounds. I need to be close. The deputy's expression softened slightly at her determination. It was clear he respected Daisy, perhaps even harbored some affection for her. Your dedication to your patients is admirable, doctor, but it's not negotiable, Deputy Harris, she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. I'll be there whether you approve or not. The only question is whether Mr. Kane will be helping you stop Blackwell or sitting in your jail cell while people die unnecessarily. Harris looked between them, recognizing the united front they presented. After a long moment, he sighed heavily. I must be losing my mind, he muttered. All right, Kane. You'll help us tomorrow, but under strict conditions. You'll surrender your weapon to me after the confrontation, regardless of the outcome. You'll remain in Lyndon until the territorial marshal arrives to review your case. And you'll be under my direct supervision at all times during the operation. Relief flooded through Xander, though he was careful not to show it. Agreed. I still don't trust you, Harris added bluntly, but the doctor's evidence is troubling, and we need every gun we can get tomorrow. You won't regret this, Daisy assured him, rising from her chair. I already do, Harris replied dryly. Now, if we're going to plan this properly, I need to know everything you can tell me about Blackwell's methods, Kane. How many men, what kind of approach, preferred tactics, everything. For the next 2 hours, they developed a strategy based on Xander's intimate knowledge of Blackwell's operations. The outlaw typically employed between 6 and 8 men for bank robberies, positioning lookouts at key vantage points before sending his main force through the front door. He preferred early morning robberies when few customers would be present, but the day's cash would be accessible, and he always led from the front, never sending his men where he wouldn't go himself. He's arrogant, Xander explained, believes his own legend. But he's also cautious. He won't commit unless he believes the odds are heavily in his favor. So we need to make him think they are, Harris concluded. Let him see just enough of our defenses to believe he can overwhelm them, while keeping our true strength hidden. Xander nodded, impressed despite himself with the young deputy's strategic thinking. Exactly, and we need to make sure he enters the bank. If we can contain the situation inside, fewer civilians will be at risk, and we'll have a better chance of taking Blackwell alive. Taking him alive is a priority, Harris questioned. Most folks would say a bullet is all he deserves. A dead man can't clear my name, Xander replied simply. I need Blackwell to confess to what he did 5 years ago. That only happens if he's breathing." Harris considered this, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. We'll try to take him alive, but my first priority is protecting this town. If it comes down to Blackwell's life or the lives of Lyndon citizens, I won't hesitate." "Understood," Xander agreed, knowing it was the best concession he could hope for. As they finalized their plans, a strange sense of coming full circle settled over Xander. 5 years ago, he had fled Lyndon in disgrace, haunted by his brother's death and the false accusations against him. Now he was preparing to face the man responsible for his brother's murder in the very same town, with allies he would never have expected. The symmetry felt almost predestined, though Xander had long since stopped believing in such things. When they finally emerged from the sheriff's office into the pre-dawn darkness, Daisy touched Xander's arm lightly. "You should rest," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Tomorrow will demand everything from you." "I doubt I could sleep," he admitted. "Too much at stake." Harris locked the office door behind them, pocketing the key. "Try anyway," he advised gruffly. "A tired gun hand makes mistakes, and we can't afford any tomorrow." He hesitated, then added reluctantly, "You can stay at the boarding house under house arrest. I'll post a man outside your door for the town's protection and yours." It was more consideration than Xander had expected from the deputy. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Don't thank me yet," Harris replied. "If tomorrow goes badly, you'll wish I'd locked you up tonight." As they parted ways, Harris to continue organizing the town's defenses, Xander to his watched confinement at the boarding house. Daisy lingered, her eyes reflecting the starlight above. "Be careful tomorrow," she said softly. "Remember your promise." "I'll be alive at sunset," he assured her, wishing they were alone so he could express the full depth of what she had come to mean to him. "After that, we can figure out the rest together." She nodded, her smile small but genuine. "Together," she echoed, the word carrying the weight of a vow. As Xander watched her walk away, toward her home and the preparations she would make for the coming day, he felt a strange peace settle over him despite the danger that lay ahead. Whatever happened with Blackwell tomorrow, he was no longer alone in his fight. For a man who had walked in darkness for 5 long years, that knowledge shone like the first rays of dawn on the horizon. The morning of September 16th dawned clear and cool, the first hint of autumn crispness in the air. Xander stood in his room at the boarding house, checking his revolver one final time before tucking it into its holster. The deputy who had guarded his door overnight, a stonemason named Garrett who had been hastily deputized, watched him warily. "It's time," Garrett said, glancing at the small clock on the dresser. "Deputy Harris wants everyone in position before the payroll wagon arrives." Xander nodded, settling his hat on his head. "Let's go." They made their way through the quiet streets of Lyndon, where an unnatural stillness had settled. Word of the impending confrontation had spread throughout the town, and most civilians had wisely chosen to remain indoors. The few people they passed hurried along with nervous glances over their shoulders, clearly anxious to be off the streets before trouble began. At the bank, Deputy Harris had positioned his men according to the plan they had developed. 2 deputies were visible on the street, ostentatiously guarding the front entrance. 3 more were hidden in strategic locations, with clear lines of sight to the bank, one in the bell tower of the small church across the square, another in an upstairs window of the mercantile, and a third on the roof of the saloon. Harris himself, along with Xander and 2 more deputies, would wait inside the bank. "All quiet so far," Harris reported as Xander entered the bank. "Payroll wagon was spotted 5 miles out, moving fast. Should be here within the hour." Xander scanned the bank's interior, noting the defensive positions Harris had established. The layout was painfully familiar: the counter where tellers would normally stand, the manager's office to the right, the open area where customers would queue. It was here, 5 years ago, that Michael had fallen, his blood soaking into the polished wooden floor. They had replaced the floorboards since then, Xander noted, but in his mind he could still see the dark stain spreading from his brother's chest. "You all right?" Harris asked, noticing Xander's distant expression. "Fine," Xander replied curtly, pushing the memories aside. "Just getting my bearings." Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the manager's office. "You'll be in there initially, out of sight. When Blackwell and his men enter, I'll give the signal. We want them fully committed before we show our hand. And the bank staff, manager and 2 tellers, are in the vault room at the back. They'll stay there until this is over." Harris checked his pocket watch. "Payroll should arrive at 8. If Blackwell follows his usual pattern, he'll make his move shortly after the money is secured in the vault." Xander moved to the window, carefully peering out at the street while staying hidden from outside view. "He'll have scouts watching the bank already," he observed. "They'll report our visible defenses, but with luck, they won't know about the men inside." "That's the hope," Harris agreed. "We want Blackwell to think he's facing only the 2 guards outside, with perhaps a few more nearby. If he believes he has superior numbers, he'll commit to the robbery." The next 30 minutes passed in tense silence as they completed their preparations. At precisely 8 o'clock, the payroll wagon rumbled into view, escorted by 4 armed guards on horseback. The transfer of the money to the bank went smoothly, with no sign of Blackwell or his men. By 8:30, the payroll, nearly $10,000 for the silver mine's monthly wages, was secured in the vault, and the waiting game began. "He'll come," Xander assured Harris, who was beginning to look doubtful. "Blackwell doesn't abandon a target once he's set his sights on it." As if summoned by his words, the street outside suddenly erupted in gunfire. One of the visible guards at the bank entrance fell immediately, while the other took cover behind a water trough, returning fire at unseen assailants. "It's starting," Harris said grimly, drawing his revolver. "Take your position, Kane." Xander moved to the manager's office as planned, drawing his Colt and positioning himself where he could see the bank's entrance while remaining concealed. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear but from anticipation. After 5 years of running, of carrying the weight of false accusations, he was finally facing the moment of reckoning. Through the window, he caught glimpses of riders moving rapidly down the street toward the bank. More gunfire erupted as the town's defenders engaged Blackwell's men. Then, with a crash, the bank doors burst open and 3 armed men rushed inside, their faces partially concealed by bandanas. Xander recognized James Blackwell instantly, despite the years that had passed. The outlaw leader had aged, his once dark hair now streaked with gray, but his cold eyes and commanding presence were unchanged. He moved with the same arrogant confidence Xander remembered, sweeping his gun across the seemingly empty bank. "Come on out," Blackwell called, his voice carrying easily in the cavernous space. "I know you're in here, lawman. No need for anyone else to die today if you cooperate." Harris, concealed behind the teller's counter, remained silent. The 2 deputies hidden elsewhere in the bank likewise held their positions, waiting for the signal to reveal themselves. "Have it your way," Blackwell shrugged, gesturing to his companions. "Check the back, find the vault and whoever's hiding with it." As one of the men moved toward the rear of the bank, Harris gave the signal, a sharp whistle that cut through the tension like a knife. Immediately, the hidden deputies rose from their positions, guns trained on Blackwell and his men. "Drop your weapons," Harris ordered, standing up from behind the counter. "You're surrounded, Blackwell." The outlaw's expression registered surprise, then calculation as he assessed the situation. His companions hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the trap. It was the moment Xander had been waiting for. He stepped out from the manager's office, his Colt leveled directly at Blackwell. "Hello, James," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions roiling within him. "Remember me?" Blackwell's eyes widened in genuine shock, his gun hand faltering momentarily. "Kane," he breathed. "You're supposed to be dead or halfway to Mexico by now." "Sorry to disappoint," Xander replied coldly. "I've been waiting a long time for this moment." Understanding dawned in Blackwell's eyes, followed by a dangerous smile. "Well, well, the prodigal murderer returns to the scene of his crime." "How poetic." "The only murderer here is you," Xander countered. "You shot my brother 5 years ago, then made sure I took the blame." Blackwell's gaze flicked between Xander and Harris, clearly trying to determine the relationship between them. "Deputy," he called, not taking his eyes off Xander, "you do realize you're standing next to the man who killed his own brother in cold blood. The territory's had a bounty on his head for years." "I'm aware of who he is," Harris replied evenly. "I'm also aware that there are some discrepancies in the official account of what happened that day. Discrepancies we intend to resolve with your help." Blackwell laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "My help? You must be even more desperate than you look, Deputy." "Drop your weapons, Blackwell," Harris ordered again. "It's over. Your men outside are either dead or captured by now." As if to confirm his words, the gunfire in the street had indeed subsided, replaced by shouted orders and the sound of horses being brought under control. Blackwell seemed to register this, his expression hardening as he realized his escape routes were likely cut off. "It's never over," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Not while I'm breathing." What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity that only moments of extreme danger can bring. Blackwell's hand twitched toward his second gun, hidden in his waistband. Xander, anticipating the move, launched himself forward even as Harris shouted a warning. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Blackwell's companions reacted, engaging the deputies in a desperate exchange of shots. Xander collided with Blackwell, driving them both to the floor as a bullet whizzed past where his head had been an instant before. They struggled for control, Blackwell's strength surprising for a man his age. Xander managed to pin the outlaw's gun hand to the floor, but Blackwell's free hand found his throat, squeezing with murderous intent. "Should have killed you along with your brother," Blackwell snarled, his face contorted with hatred. "Always knew you'd be trouble." Xander struck at Blackwell's elbow with the butt of his revolver, breaking the choke hold. "Admit it," he gasped, pressing the barrel of his gun against Blackwell's chest. "Admit you killed Michael. Say it so they can hear you." Blackwell's eyes darted to where Harris was engaged in a firefight with one of his men, then back to Xander. A sly calculation entered his expression. "What's it worth to you, Kane?" he asked, his voice low. "Your freedom, your life back, just the truth," Xander replied, increasing the pressure of the gun. "That's all I've ever wanted." "The truth," Blackwell echoed mockingly. "The truth is, your brother was a fool who thought he could play hero, just like you." Around them, the gunfight was reaching its conclusion. One of Blackwell's men lay motionless on the floor, while the other had been disarmed and was being secured by a deputy. Harris approached cautiously, his gun trained on Blackwell. "Last chance," Xander said, aware that their moment of privacy was ending. "Confess, or I swear to God you'll what?" Blackwell challenged. "Kill me, go ahead. Then you'll never clear your name." "You'll always be the man who murdered his brother," no matter what you do. The truth of the words struck Xander like a physical blow. Even if he killed Blackwell now, there was no guarantee anyone would believe his version of events. Without a confession, he would remain a wanted man, possibly facing murder charges for Blackwell's death as well. "Kane," Harris called, now standing over them. "Step back. He's finished." Xander hesitated, the weight of 5 years of injustice pressing down on him. The desire to pull the trigger, to end Blackwell's life as Blackwell had ended Michael's, was almost overwhelming. But in his mind, he heard Daisy's voice, reminding him that vengeance would not bring the peace he sought. With a supreme effort of will, Xander released Blackwell and rose to his feet, keeping his gun trained on the outlaw. "He's all yours, deputy," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "But this isn't over." Harris nodded, motioning for one of his men to secure Blackwell. As the deputy approached with handcuffs, Blackwell made one last, desperate move. His hand flashed to his boot, emerging with a small derringer that had escaped their notice. Before anyone could react, he aimed not at Harris or the approaching deputy, but at Xander. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space of the bank. Xander felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, the impact spinning him half around. His own gun discharged reflexively, the bullet striking Blackwell in the chest. The outlaw staggered backward, a look of surprise on his face before collapsing to the floor. "Damn it," Harris shouted, rushing to Blackwell's side. "We needed him alive." Xander pressed his hand to his wounded shoulder, feeling warm blood seep between his fingers. "Wasn't my intention," he gasped, pain radiating through his body. He drew first. Harris checked Blackwell's pulse, his expression grim. "He's still breathing, but barely. Get the doctor," he ordered one of the deputies. "Now." The world began to gray at the edges of Xander's vision as shock set in. He leaned against the bank counter, struggling to remain conscious. This wasn't how it was supposed to end, Blackwell dying before confessing, his own wound potentially serious. The possibility that he had come this far only to fail at the final moment was almost more painful than the bullet in his shoulder. "Stay with me, Kane," Harris said, moving to support him. "The doctor's coming. You've got to stay awake." "Blackwell," Xander managed to say, "need him to confess." "I know," Harris replied, helping him to a chair. "We'll do what we can for him, but you need to focus on staying alive right now." The bank doors burst open and Daisy rushed in, her medical bag clutched in one hand. Her face paled when she saw Xander, but professional composure quickly reasserted itself as she assessed the situation. "Who's more critical?" she asked Harris, already moving to examine Xander's wound. "Blackwell took one to the chest," Harris replied. "He's fading fast." Daisy's eyes met Xander's, understanding passing between them without words. She squeezed his hand briefly before turning to the outlaw leader. "Keep pressure on your wound," she instructed Xander. "I'll be back for you as soon as I can." Xander watched through a haze of pain as Daisy knelt beside Blackwell, working quickly to stabilize him. The outlaw's breathing was labored, blood bubbling at his lips with each exhale, signs that the bullet had likely punctured a lung. Despite everything the man had done, Xander found himself hoping Daisy could save him, not out of compassion, but because Blackwell's death would take the truth with it. Time seemed to stretch and compress as Xander drifted in and out of awareness. He was vaguely conscious of Daisy returning to his side, of the sharp pain as she extracted the bullet from his shoulder, of her voice murmuring reassurances as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. But his focus remained on Blackwell, willing the man to live long enough to speak the words that would set him free. "He's asking for you," Daisy said finally, helping Xander to his feet. "I've done what I can, but he doesn't have much time. If you want to speak with him, it needs to be now." With Daisy's support, Xander made his way to where Blackwell lay on the bank floor, a makeshift bandage covering his chest wound. Harris stood nearby, watching with a mixture of wariness and resignation. "Kane," Blackwell wheezed as Xander knelt beside him. "Looks like we both lose." "Not both of us," Xander replied quietly. "You can still do one right thing before you die, James. Tell the truth about what happened that day." Blackwell's lips twisted in a bloody approximation of a smile. "Why would I give you that satisfaction?" "Not for me," Xander said. "For Michael. He deserves to have his name cleared too. People think he was your accomplice, that he turned on you, and that's why I shot him. That's not how he should be remembered." Something flickered in Blackwell's fading eyes, not remorse exactly, but perhaps a grudging recognition of the appeal to honor. He glanced at Harris, then at Daisy before returning his gaze to Xander. "Your brother," he began, his voice barely audible, "was trying to stop the robbery. You both were. I shot him when he drew on me, then made sure everyone thought it was you." Harris stepped closer, disbelief written across his features. "You're admitting that Xander Kane is innocent, that you framed him for his brother's murder?" Blackwell coughed, blood spattering his lips. "What's it matter now?" he rasped. "Can't hang a dead man." "Why?" Xander asked, needing to understand. "Why frame me specifically?" "Needed a scapegoat," Blackwell managed. "You were convenient, had to get away clean. Having the law chase you instead of me worked well." The simple practicality of the explanation was somehow more devastating than any personal vendetta might have been. Michael had died and Xander's life had been destroyed not out of hatred or revenge, but because it had been convenient for Blackwell's escape. "Write it down," Harris said suddenly, turning to one of the deputies. "Get paper, a pen. We need his confession in writing, witnessed." The next few minutes were a blur of activity as Harris took Blackwell's formal confession, the outlaw's voice growing weaker with each word. Daisy remained at Xander's side, her hand resting supportively on his uninjured shoulder as the truth he had sought for so long was finally spoken aloud and recorded for posterity. "Is it enough?" Xander asked Harris when the confession was complete, Blackwell's signature a shaky scrawl at the bottom of the page. The deputy studied the document, then looked at Xander with new eyes, not those of a lawman regarding a criminal, but of one man recognizing another's long suffering. "It's enough," he confirmed. "I'll send this to the territorial marshal with my own statement. Your name will be cleared, Kane." Relief washed over Xander, so profound it made him light-headed, or perhaps that was the blood loss. Either way, he swayed on his feet, steadied only by Daisy's quick support. "He needs rest," she told Harris firmly. "His wound isn't life-threatening, but he's lost blood and been through an ordeal." Harris nodded, glancing at Blackwell, who had lapsed into unconsciousness. "Take him to your clinic, doctor. He's no longer under arrest, but I'd appreciate it if he remained in Lyndon until this matter is fully resolved with the marshal's office." "Of course," Daisy agreed, already guiding Xander toward the door. "He'll be staying right where I can keep an eye on him." As they emerged from the bank into the sunlight, Xander was struck by the chaos that had engulfed the street. Several bodies lay covered with blankets, Blackwell's men who had died in the firefight. The town's defenders were securing prisoners and tending to the wounded. Citizens were beginning to emerge from their homes, eager for news of what had transpired. "It's over," Daisy murmured, her arm around Xander's waist as she supported him toward her clinic. "It's finally over." Xander gazed at the town that had once cast him out, that would now know the truth about that terrible day 5 years ago. "Not quite," he replied, his eyes finding hers. "Some things are just beginning." James Blackwell died that evening without regaining consciousness, taking whatever remaining secrets he held to his grave. His written confession, however, stood as testament to the truth Xander had proclaimed for 5 long years. Deputy Harris sent it to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, along with his own account of the events at the bank and Daisy's evidence regarding the bullet that had killed Michael Kane. The response came 3 days later, a formal declaration clearing Xander of all charges related to his brother's death and the bank robbery. The wanted posters bearing his face would be recalled, the bounty rescinded. After half a decade as a fugitive, Xander Kane was a free man. The news spread quickly through Lyndon, eliciting mixed reactions from the townspeople. Some, particularly those who had been present during the original incident, were reluctant to accept Xander's innocence despite the evidence. Others offered awkward apologies or simply nodded in acknowledgement when they passed him on the street. A few, like Patrick Hodges at the livery, expressed genuine regret for having believed the worst of him. "Job's still yours if you want it," Hodges told him gruffly the day after the marshal's declaration arrived. "Could use a man who knows horses like you do." Xander had thanked him for the offer but asked for time to consider his plans. The truth was, he wasn't certain what those plans were. For so long, his sole purpose had been clearing his name. Now that he had achieved that goal, the future stretched before him like an unmapped territory. During his recovery, Xander had stayed at Daisy's clinic, initially as her patient and then, as his wound healed, as her what? Friend seemed too inadequate a word for what had developed between them. They had faced danger together, shared confidences, stood shoulder to shoulder against both the law and the lawless. Something deeper had grown from those shared experiences. Something neither had yet put into words but that hung in the air between them whenever they were alone. 1 week after the shootout at the bank, with his shoulder healing well and his name officially cleared, Xander found himself sitting on the porch of Daisy's house as the sun set over Lyndon. The town was returning to its normal rhythms, the excitement of the bank robbery and subsequent revelations gradually fading into local legend. Daisy emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Xander before settling into the chair beside his. "Deputy Harris stopped by the clinic today," she said, blowing gently on the hot liquid. "The territorial marshal is quite impressed with how he handled the Blackwell situation. There's talk of offering him the full marshal position." "He deserves it," Xander replied sincerely. "He took a chance on me when he had every reason not to. That shows good judgment." "He also mentioned that the bank is planning a small ceremony," she continued. "They want to place a new headstone on Michael's grave, one that acknowledges his heroism in trying to stop the robbery." Xander stared into his coffee, emotions welling within him at the thought of his brother finally receiving the recognition he deserved. "That would be appropriate," he managed. Daisy's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own in a gesture that had become familiar during his convalescence. "Have you decided what you'll do now?" she asked, the question light but laden with unspoken meaning. He turned to look at her, taking in the golden light of sunset on her face, the quiet strength in her eyes that had been his anchor through the storm of recent events. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "For so long, all I wanted was to clear my name, to be able to stop running. Now that I have that, I'm not sure what comes next." "You could stay in Lyndon," she suggested, her voice carefully neutral despite the hope that flickered in her eyes. "Start fresh here. The livery position is available, and I believe most of the town would accept your presence given time." "I could," he agreed, squeezing her hand gently. "But would that be enough for you?" The directness of the question brought a flush to her cheeks. "For me, Daisy," he said softly, turning fully toward her, I'm not a fool. I know that whatever I decide affects you too, these past weeks. What's grown between us isn't something I can simply walk away from. Nor do I want to. Her eyes widened slightly, her composure faltering for perhaps the first time since he'd known her. What are you saying, Xander? I'm saying that I love you, he replied simply, the words he'd held back for weeks finally finding voice. I think I started falling in love with you that day at the cemetery, when you told me you believed my brother's killer had never been brought to justice. You saw the truth when no one else would look for it. You risked everything to help me clear my name. How could I not love you for that? Tears gathered in her eyes, though her smile was radiant. I had hoped, she whispered, but I didn't dare assume. Assume what? That a former fugitive with nothing to his name but a horse and a gun would fall desperately in love with the most remarkable woman he'd ever met. He smiled, releasing her hand to gently brush a tear from her cheek. Seems inevitable in retrospect. She laughed, a sound of pure joy that made his heart swell. When you put it that way, she teased, before her expression grew more serious. I love you too, Xander. I think I knew it the moment you stood in my study and finally trusted me with your true identity. You showed such courage, such integrity despite everything you'd suffered. How could I not love you for that? The echo of his own words sent warmth spreading through him. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until their foreheads touched, their breath mingling in the small space between their lips. So I'll stay, he murmured. If you'll have me. I'll have you, she replied, her voice soft but certain, for as long as you'll stay. Their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of dawn after the longest night, gentle at first, then deepening with the release of long, restrained emotion. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that heralded the end of one day and the promise of another to follow. I should warn you, Xander said, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. I don't make a very good patient. Staying might mean you'll have to marry me just to keep me in line. Her laughter was like music, filling spaces within him that had been empty for too long. Is that a proposal, Mr. Kane? The first of many, Dr. Lillian, he promised. Until you say yes. Then yes, she replied without hesitation, her eyes shining with love and certainty. Yes, I will marry you, Xander Kane. As darkness settled over Lyndon, Wyoming, they remained on the porch, planning their future together in quiet conversations punctuated by tender kisses and shared laughter. For a man whose past had been as dark as midnight, Daisy Lillian had indeed brought the dawn not just of a new day, but of a new life filled with the light of love, trust, and the peace that comes from finally finding home in another's heart. They were married that autumn, in a simple ceremony at the small church overlooking Lyndon. Deputy Harris, now Marshal Harris, stood as Xander's best man, a testament to the unlikely friendship that had developed between them. The townspeople attended in surprising numbers, many offering genuine congratulations to the couple whose story had captured their imagination. In the years that followed, Xander and Daisy built a life together that neither could have imagined during those tense days of confrontation and revelation. Xander eventually purchased the livery from Patrick Hodges when the older man retired, expanding it into one of the finest horse breeding operations in the territory. Daisy continued her medical practice, training a young assistant to eventually share her duties as their family grew. Their first child, a son they named Michael after Xander's brother, was born just over a year after their wedding, a sturdy boy with his mother's bright eyes and his father's determined spirit. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and another son, William, 2 years after that. Their home, built on land just outside town where the livery now stood, became known for its warmth and hospitality. Xander never forgot his brother or the injustice that had driven him from Lyndon all those years ago. Each year, on the anniversary of Michael's death, he would visit the cemetery with Daisy and their children, placing flowers on the new headstone that properly honored Michael's courage. It was a ritual of remembrance, but also of gratitude for the second chance that had emerged from tragedy. 10 years after the confrontation with Blackwell, as Xander stood on the porch of their home watching their children play in the yard, Daisy joined him, slipping her arm around his waist in a gesture as familiar as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, following his gaze to where young Michael was teaching his siblings how to throw a lasso. "How different things might have been," he replied honestly. "If I hadn't come back to Lyndon that day, if you hadn't believed in me when no one else would." She rested her head against his shoulder, her presence as steady and reassuring as it had been since the day they met. "Some things are meant to be, Xander. No matter how dark the night, dawn always comes eventually." He smiled, turning to kiss the top of her head. "My very own dawn," he murmured. "Every day for the rest of our lives." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, bathing their home and family in golden light, Xander Kane felt the familiar swell of gratitude that had become the cornerstone of his new life. The shadows of the past would always be part of his story, but they no longer defined him. Instead, he was defined by love for his wife, their children, the community that had eventually embraced him, and the future they would continue to build together in the growing town of Lyndon, Wyoming. For a man who had once lived as a ghost, always looking over his shoulder, always moving on before connections could form, this life of roots and relationships was the most precious gift imaginable. Each sunrise brought new possibilities, each sunset the satisfaction of another day lived fully in the light, and when occasional nightmares of that terrible day in the bank still haunted his sleep, Daisy was always there, her love the surest remedy for the lingering darkness. "I'm here," she would whisper, drawing him back to the present, to the life they had created from the ashes of his past. "I'm here and so are you. The darkness is behind us now." In those moments, holding her close in the quiet of their bedroom, Xander knew with absolute certainty that his brother would have approved of the man he had become, not the fugitive running from false accusations, but the husband, father, and respected citizen who had found the courage to face his past, and in doing so, claim his future. That knowledge, more than the cleared name or the comfortable life he now led, was perhaps the greatest gift Daisy had given him, the ability to reconcile with his past without being defined by it, to honor Michael's memory by living fully rather than existing in the shadows of what might have been. And as their family continued to grow, eventually including grandchildren who knew the story of their grandfather's redemption as a cherished family legend rather than a painful memory, Xander and Daisy remained each other's constant, the steady flame that had illuminated the darkness, and continued to light their way forward through all of life's challenges and joys. In the end, it was their love born in the unlikeliest of circumstances, tested by danger, and strengthened through years of shared experiences that stood as testimony to the truth that had guided them from their first meeting. That even for those who walk in darkness, dawn will come, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the healing power of love's unwavering light.